When is DTOOC not best in slot on your weapon? This is kind of an iffy subject, and it's something that I have touched on, and I believe IKEA did a wondrous epic, which I do recommend you watch. I'll link it in the description below. It is a bit hefty, but there's a lot of information in there, so just bookmark it and get around to it at some point. It is worth the watch. However, as we all know, DTOOC is basically the best attribute to put on your weapon if it doesn't already come with DTOOC, damage to targets out of cover, on it already. Looking at you LMGs. That being said, there are a few examples of where DTOOC actually isn't the thing you should be looking at. And these are typically builds where all of your damage comes from other sources other than you shooting something, which does seem a bit weird, but there are a few builds where this does happen. And then there's another build that if you really want to get hot and sweaty, DTOOC actually isn't the way you want to go. So that's actually where we're going to be looking on this video. The first one is going to be just your standard explosive build. You don't actually want DTOOC on this, you want damage to armor. And the reason for this is kind of twofold. One, explosive damage scales with damage to armor. It does not scale with damage to targets out of cover. Two, small bit with the mortar, it does proc bleed, and bleed also scales with damage to armor. Now, hopefully we can see here, the highest we really got with our Seekers with Harmony out, which has 6% damage to armor, is about like 4.5 mil. We got a few 4.3s, but the highest we got is like 4.5 mil, which is perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with that. Now, if we swap to Capacitor, Capacitor has 12% damage to armor on it. So all we're going to do now is just reset the range, redouble check that we've still got our 4.5 mil showing, and then we're just going to, with Capacitor out, just throw more Seekers, and ta-da, the highest we now get is like 4.7. This isn't a large increase, don't get me wrong, but it's a lot more than what you would get if you just didn't have damage to armor in the first place. So on something like a mortar build, damage to armor is the best way to go. Likewise with a build like Eclipse, where both the fire, the burn, and the explosion from these scales with damage to armor. The shotgun doesn't have damage to armor, the rifle has 6%, and then a Capacitor, again, 12%. You can see the ticks were changing on screen. The last one is, like I said, if you really want to get sweaty. You don't necessarily have to run this. I personally don't. It's mostly going to be like prevalent in if you start doing like speed runs, particularly legendary, and it's mostly only really used on a Headhunter's Fury build. That's 4-piece Hunter's Fury, a chest with Headhunter, and then a backpack with Headshot or something with Vigilance, essentially. And what you would do is you would have two M870s, one with damage to targets out of cover, and the other one with health damage. Now you might notice health damage is 9.5, where damage to targets out of cover is 10. The reason we do health damage is simply just for Chungers and Warhounds. That is it. Due to the way in which damage to health works with Headhunter, it basically applies multiple times throughout the calculation. So it just means that if you're not quite maximum stacks, you can still get more damage out with the damage to health on that first initial shot than you would be able to with damage to targets out of cover. It really is just quite simply that. There's not really a lot to it. Now we're going to put our tinfoil hat on and look at the changes coming up. With the build here, 4-piece strikers, a Cheska chest, coyotes, 58 crit chance, 161 crit damage with coyotes. And just in case you can't see that there's a difference on the weapon, here's a close-up. One has damage to targets out of cover, one has rate of fire. But we're going to assume, because the devs did say that they are going to be looking at changing the stat values for the third attribute. A lot of people are thinking that they're going to nerf the stat attributes for things like DTOOC. However, I feel like they're going to be buffing them. And the main reason I feel like they're going to be buffing them is I can't really see them changing anything on the LMGs, which come with a native 12% damage to targets out of cover, which basically means with the changes they've already suggested, something like an L86 is already doing 21% more DPS than a FAMAS. If they then change damage to targets out of cover from like a 10% roll to 6 or even 5, but leave that 12% roll on LMGs, well, that 21% is going to go to like a 26 or 27% difference. We're pushing the 30% difference. And for all those people that on that video said, no, this, like, who cares, it's an LMG. If we can get close to a 30% difference, everyone will care. L86 and the RPK will be the new meta if they reduce the stat rolls. So I'm thinking they're going to increase them. So what we're going to do is we're now going to calculate this exact same build, but rather than being 5% rate of fire, we're going to look at what would happen if it was a 10% rate of fire, which is what I feel is a lot more likely, personally. So this is what the build looks like in a spreadsheet. The only real difference is the DTOOC build has 0.1 in DTOOC, whereas ROF has nothing. And obviously in the DPS, there's a difference in the RPM. There's a 1.2% difference between them in DPS, and this is just simply because multipliers multiply, essentially. However, at this point, a lot of you are going, oh, like, this seems to be like a null point. DTOOC is still winning. Yes, but this is a strikers build which requires stacking. So if we now just have a look at the difference in their RPMs and the rate in which they will build stacks, the build of DTOOC gets 16 stacks per second, where the build of rate of fire gets 18 stacks per second. Now this might not seem like a huge difference, but again, if we now just put this into the spreadsheet, so now we have rate of fire with 18 stacks and DTOOC with 16 stacks, and you can see the rate of fire is now winning by 0.5%. Now this might not seem like a lot, but you've got to remember this is after 1 second. So what happens if we now just put this to 2 seconds? Well, we're now approaching a 2% difference, and this essentially just keeps going until we essentially are able to hit max stacks with one of them first, which is going to look something along the lines of this. Now this entire process is going to take approximately 5 seconds. It's just over 5. So at this point, rate of fire is going to be at 100 stacks and DTOOC is going to be at 80 stacks. This is a 9.79% difference in their overall DPS. So what is now going to be the problem is, what do you as the player wish to prioritize? The top end damage or the damage while stacking? Now, due to the rate in which striker stacks actually decay, my personal preference is actually going to be the stacking damage. It just means I'm going to get more stacks more quickly. That's going to be outperforming DTOOC during that stacking process, personally. This is going to be the same with things like Obliterate, Strikers, and Heartbreaker. But that's just my personal opinion. And this is only if they actually do put rate of fire to 10%. If they put it to 11%, then rate of fire is going to win 100% of the time. Like even at top end stats, if rate of fire goes to 11%, it's going to be unreal. So hopefully in this video, do a quick recap. DTOOC isn't always the best thing to put on your weapon. However, those that don't really benefit from DTOOC are few and far between. The only two that I really know of that most people would run would be a mortar build and an eclipse build. And if you are a speedrunner or someone that wants to get really sweaty with your Headhunter's Fury, typically you run 2 M870s, one with damage to targets out of cover and the other with damage to health. That is basically it when it comes to what we have in the game right now. And then tinfoil hat on, when they start to change the attributes, potentially on certain builds, predominantly the ones that require stacking. Like I said, if you're using Obliterate, this could potentially be more beneficial. However, that's also going to be RNG, because not only do you need to hit quicker, but to hopefully hit quicker, but you also are relying on those hits being crits, so not as much. But the two more prominent ones are going to be potentially, keyword potentially, Heartbreaker and Strikers, because hitting the target, regardless whether it's a crit or not, or headshot, doesn't matter, hitting the target will give you 1 stack. So if we're able to increase the rate in which we're able to build those stacks, this does potentially mean that some of those builds will be more powerful. Now annoyingly, this might mean that we need to get 2 Elmos per character, or for a variety of different things. Something like Elmos on a high-end build, you're not really going to be relying on stacks that much, or if at all, so DTOOC is going to be the better option. However, potentially, rate of fire, depending on how much it does get buffed, or even potentially if DTOOC does get nerfed, which I don't think they will, Rate of Fire on things like Strikers and Heartbreaker could be the better option, but we don't know for certain yet. So please just keep this in mind. And just in case, the one thing I'd recommend along this path is if you've already got an Elmo on a character, start farming for a second one and just keep it in your stash or somewhere pretty on your character, just in case. This way you can have one with DTOOC and one with Rate of Fire. But I would recommend holding off on that until the updates hit, or you never know, it might also be coming in the next PTS, which is the 19th of January, I believe. Anyway, in the meantime, have fun, good luck, and don't die. It's bad for the health.